Hey, how's it going everyone? In this video, we're going to be making this retro themed title animation inside of Blender. Let's get into it. Alright, so I have this general scene open up inside of Blender. I'm using Blender 2.9 for this video. And before we get started, I'm going to change a few of the settings. So I'm going to come over here to the output properties and I'm going to change the frame rate to 30 frames a second. If you come down here, you can change where you want your file to be saved to. And I always just use a PNG sequence, but go ahead and choose whatever file format you like working with. And I'm going to come up here to the render settings. I'm going to enable ambient occlusion, bloom, and screen space reflections. And now we're good to start, so I'm going to delete this light, and for right now I'll bring this cube out on the y-axis. I'm going to go ahead and add in a plane, and in edit mode I'm going to scale that to about 55, and I'm going to give it a subdivision of about 80. We can change this later on depending on how dense you're going to want your grid to be, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Now add in a circle. I'm going to give it about 50 vertices, and in edit mode I'm going to hit F to fill it. I'm going to rotate it on the X by 90, and I'm going to bring it out on the Y until it's just a little bit past our plane here. Hit S and scale it by 6, and under the object properties, bring it up on the Z by 12. Now go ahead and add this cube here and bring it up to where it's intersecting with the circle, and if we go to the front view, we can kind of manipulate this a little bit. I'm going to scale it on the X just so it's a little bit longer than our circle, and then scale it on the Z just so it's a little bit thinner. And this is what we're going to use to create the lines in our sun. So I'm going to bring this just above the circle, and I'm going to come over to the modifiers tab and give it an array modifier. I'm going to zero out the X and bring it down on the Z. I'll give it a count of about 8, and then I'll adjust it on the Z to get the spacing that I want. So right there looks fine for me. Alright, so now what we can do is select our circle and add in a Boolean modifier. And for the object, choose the cube. Come up here and hit apply, and now if we delete our cube, you can see that now we have the lines inside of what's going to be our sun. So now let's go ahead and adjust the camera. I'm going to zero out the location and the rotation for right now. For the location on the Y, I'm going to set it to -11, and for the X rotation, I'm going to set it to 90. And if we come into our camera angle, this is what it looks like. I'm just going to bring it up a little bit on the Z. Right there looks fine. And for me, I'm not going to have the sun fully in the frame. I'm going to have the top part cut off right here, so that looks fine for me. Okay, so now we can add in our text. I'm going to go Shift A, add in text. Come down here. I'll go ahead and change this to say cyber. And then in the character properties, I'll change the alignment to center on both of these. And the geometry right now, I'll set it to 0.1 on the extrusion. Rotate this on the X by 90. And in our camera view, we can go ahead and bring this up on the Z right there. And for the font, I downloaded one for free that kind of fits the theme. So I'm going to go ahead and import that. That's looking good. I'm going to scale it down just a bit. And if I zoom in here, I can adjust my extrusion. I want it to be a little bit thicker than that. So I'll come back up to geometry and extrude that out more. About right there looks fine. I'll do 0.55. Okay, so now we can go ahead and select our text, right click and convert to mesh, and if we come to the wireframe mode, you can see the topology is just trash. So go to the modifiers and add in a remesh modifier, if I can find it right there. Let's click sharp and uncheck remove disconnected, and we can set the octree depth to like 8 or 9. So that's looking much better, and then we can enable smooth shading, come up and apply it. And then now what I like to do is come to the front view, and I'll go into edit mode and choose my face selection up here. Come back to solid. And if you hit C, you can go ahead and highlight these front faces. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Alright, so I went ahead and highlighted all of the front faces, but you can also see that some of the faces on the side were selected. So I'm just going to go through one more time and just make sure that only these front faces are highlighted. So if I come back in here, if I hit the middle mouse wheel, it'll deselect. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that real quick. Alright, so I went through and made sure that only these front faces were highlighted. And now what I'm going to do is hit I so I can inset these faces. I'm just going to do it a little bit though. You don't want to do it too much because then this wonky stuff starts happening. So I'm just going to do it a little bit. We can move these back on the y-axis just a little bit to create this lip right here. And now we can go ahead and start to add our materials. So if we go back in object mode, we can give this a base material. So if we come down here, I'll hit new, I'll change this to an emission, and I'll give this like a light blue color, change the strength to 2. If we come into our rendered view, this is what that looks like. And back in edit mode, while all these faces are selected, let's go ahead and give this another material. So hit the plus sign up here, new, it's going to be an emissive. And for this, I'm going to give it a darker blue color, something like this, and a strength of 2 as well. And I'll hit assign, and that's what that looks like, but I'm going to bring the color down a bit like that. Let's come over to our world settings and change the background color to like a dark purple or blue. I'll bring it down just a little bit more, like right there. Alright, let's go ahead and select our sun and start adding our material. I'll join these together real quick, go back to my rendered view in the camera, and we can go ahead and get started. A lot of our materials in this are going to have a gradient texture, but let's go ahead and add in an emission. I'll plug that right there, add in a gradient texture. Hit Ctrl T to add the mapping node, and the rotation for the Z we're going to change to -90. And let's bring it up on the X just a little bit like that. Let's add in a color ramp. For this, I'm going to go with like a pink red color, something like that. And then for the top color, I'll choose like an orangey yellow right there. And I'll bring this yellow in a bit, give this an emission strength of 5. And then you can adjust the colors however you want them to look. I'm going to bring this down a little bit more. Maybe I'll change this to ease. That looks fine for me for right now. Alright, I'm going to go back to the layout window and go to solid view. I'm going to select this plane, and in edit mode, I'm going to come up to vertice selection, and I'm going to select some of these in the back here, right there on either side of the sun here. Let's make sure we have our proportional editing turned on and change this to random. Hit G and we can bring it up on the Z axis, and you can scroll up and down here just to adjust how much you want it to affect. Just find something that you like. I'm going to grab one that's kind of in the middle and bring it up to fill it out a bit right there. And now I'm going to do the same for a few in the front here, so I'll grab these, bring these up, do the same over here on this side, and then one more time I'll just select a few in the front here, and I'll just make this a little bit rough. But go ahead and mess around with it, find something that you like. I'm going to start adding some material to this, so go ahead and hit new. I'm going to make this a dark blue color. There, looks fine. Come down here, I'm going to set the metallic all the way to 1 and the roughness all the way down to 0 here. Add in one more material, new. I'm going to make this an emission. I'm going to give it that light blue color, and I'm going to set the strength to 5. Now let's go ahead and add in a wireframe modifier to this. Set the thickness to 0.01, uncheck replace original, and then we can set the material offset to 2, and now we have our grid effect. And like I said before, depending on how dense you want your grid to be, you could change your subdivisions to something like 100, but I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to come back up to the shading window, and I'm going to add in a gradient texture for this. Plug that in there. Once again, I'm going to hit Ctrl T to add the mapping node, and we can also just add in our color ramp right there. I'm going to change the rotation on the Z to -90 again. And if we come up here, we can see what this is going to look like. We have the black going into the gray. So I'm going to change this black color to a pink right there, and change the white to a blue color. Just like that. So if we come back into our camera view, we can start adjusting these colors here to get what we want. I kind of like having a color here in the foreground and then fade somewhere in the middle. So I'm going to bring this blue back a bit. Maybe right there, and I'll bring this pink up just a little bit more. Alright, I think that's looking pretty good. And now we can go ahead and start animating our text. So let's come back up to the layout window, select our text. I'm going to bring up the timeline here and come to frame 90. I'll hit I and set a keyframe for the location. I'm going to come back to frame 75, and I'm going to move this on the x-axis just so it's out of frame a little bit like that. Hit I again and set another keyframe for the location, so it's going to come in right here, but I kind of want it to go a little bit further to the right and kind of bounce back into its position. So at about frame 84, I'll bring it a little bit further to where it's towards the right side of the frame, maybe just a little bit like that. I, location, So now this is the animation that I'm looking at right here. It kind of bounces on screen. And with all these frames selected, I'll right click interpolation mode Bezier. It'll kind of ease it a little bit. Alright, so let's add in another plane. I'll rotate this on the X by 90 and bring it up to our text here. I'll scale it on the Z to where it's about the same thickness as the text. It doesn't have to be too exact. I'll bring it down just a little bit. I'm going to come down here and give this an emission material. So emission. Once again, I'm going to give it that light blue color, and I'll give this a strength of 2. Back in our camera view, I'm going to scale this on the X quite a bit, just like that, and I'll bring it over to where it's just at the end here. Let me bring it over right there, and in edit mode, I'm going to uncheck proportional editing and grab this vertice and just bring it over on the X to just kind of match this angle with the R. And with the plane selected, let's shift click on our text, right click, parent to object. So now we can see this plane is following our text right here. I'm going to go to frame 84 to where our text is the furthest right on the screen. And I'll select this plane, and in edit mode, I'll grab these 2 vertices right here, and I'm going to bring them over just to where they're right off a frame. Alright, that's looking good. Let's just adjust this material a little bit. So back in the shading window, once again, let's go ahead and add in a gradient texture. Add that in. Control T for this mapping node, and this time for the rotation, let's change the Z to 180, and let's bring in a mix shader. Plug that in right there, and let's take the gradient texture, plug it into the factor. We can unplug this and add in a transparent BSDF. Plug that in right there, and now if we adjust location on the X, you can see it slides over. So let me set that to 0, come over to the material properties, and for the blending mode, change this to alpha blend. So now when we adjust this, you can see that it's actually transparent. So let's set this to 0. I'm going to bring up a timeline here. I'm going to make sure I'm at frame 90, and for the X location, I'm going to insert a keyframe and come 10 frames forward to frame 100, and I'll bring this over. I'll just set this to 2. I'll set this to 2, right click, insert keyframe. And now let's add in an icosphere. I'm going to bring this up to our text. I'm going to scale it down on the Z a bit like that, and maybe a little bit on the X. Scale this down, and I'm going to bring it over here to the end of our text. It's going to be sticking out of the R a little bit. I'll bring it up a little bit more like that, and this is going to be used to emit some particles for when our text comes on screen. So with this selected, I'm going to shift click on our text, and I'm going to right click and parent this to the object as well. So now it comes on with the text. So let's go ahead and make one more collection. So new collection, I'm going to name this particles like that, and I'm going to add in another plane. We can just bring this to the side. Let's add an emission to this right there, give it a blue material, and I'm changing the strength to 4. Actually, I'm going to bring it up just a little bit like that. I'm going to make just a couple duplications of this, scale this up on the X, duplicate it one more time, scale it down, maybe make it a little bit wider like that. Let's make this one a little bit longer. Alright, so let's come back to our camera view and select this icosphere, and we can add in a particle system to this. For the number count, I'm going to change this to about 400. And I want this to start when the text is all the way on the right side of the screen, so that's at frame 84. I'll have it start one frame before, so at frame 83. Select the icosphere, frame start, I'll do 83, and frame end, I'll do 84. The lifetime, I'll change this to 15 frames, and I'll up the randomness a bit. Now let's come down to our render settings, change this to collection, and for the collection, let's choose the particle collection that we made. So now we can see this is what it looks like right here. We just have to adjust the rotation of these. So let's go ahead, close this. Under rotation, let's check that. Let's up this, up the randomized phase 2. So now this is what we're working with. It's looking pretty nice. Let's go back to render and just lower the scale a bit. Maybe I'll do 0.015. Alright, so under the velocity, let's change this to 2. The object alignment on the X, let's change it to 0.5, and the Z -1, and up the randomize for this as well, about right there. Now this is starting to look a little bit better. And then let's come down to the field weights and decrease the gravity a little bit. I think that's looking a lot better. And I think the last thing that we need to do is under the render settings, let's uncheck show emitter, so that way when we make our render it's not visible. Now let's make one more particle system. So go ahead and add in another cube. And let's scale this up quite a bit. We're going to use this to cover our scene. So I'll bring that up, scale it out on the X, scale it out on the Y, Let's come into our camera view here, and in edit mode, I'm just going to select these faces on the side, and just make sure that they're out of your camera frame. So if they were in a little bit like this, let's go ahead and make sure they're right outside. And we're going to need to move this out of the particles collection, so go ahead and move the cube up to the main scene collection right there. Come this way. I'll bring this face in just like that. I'll move this one in as well. Alright, so let's go ahead and add in our particle system. So with the cube selected, hit new. For the number, let's change this to about 1500. Frame start 1 is good. Let's change the end to frame 2. Lifetime randomness is going to be for the full scene, so I'll do 250 frames. Under the source, let's change this from faces to volume. So now it's going to be emitting inside the cube. The distribution, I'll change to random. Come down to the render settings, collection, and choose our particle collection. Let's come down to the field weights and change the gravity to 0, so we can see this is what it's looking like right now. We're gonna have to change the rotation, so let's come back up, rotation, up the randomize like that, maybe randomize phase. So now we can see that this is what it's looking like, much better, but I want these to be more stiff. So if we come over to the physics settings, we can change the Brownian to 1 and the damp to 0.1. So now you can see that the particles are just like floating in the air right here. And if you wanted to increase the movement for these particles, you can just up the Brownian, so just like a more exaggerated version of it. If I changed it to 10, you can kind of see how they just move more in the air, but I want them just to move a little bit. Maybe I'll change this to 2. Right there is looking fine. Maybe I'll come up here and I'll change this to like 1300. And just real quick, I'm going to come back to this icosphere and I'm going to change the dampness underneath the physics settings. I'm going to change that to 0.05. And for our cube, let's just make sure we come down here to our render settings and uncheck show emitter. Just like that, we're pretty much almost done. I think the only thing we have left to do is just animate our camera. So let's come to frame 90, hit I and set a keyframe for the location and rotation. Let's drag this back to frame 0. And for the location on the Y, let's change this to -16. The rotation on the X, let's set that to 0. And if we come over here, let's just bring this up on the Z to where it's above our ground plane right there. And once again, we can hit I and set a keyframe for the location and rotation. So now we can see this is our camera animation. And if we go to our camera view, this is what that looks like. And then something we can do for this, we can add some small camera shake. So if we change this to our graph editor, under our transforms, for the Y and the Z rotation, we can add in a modifier. So go to modifier, add in a noise modifier, and for the scale, let's set that to 120, and for the strength, let's set that to 0.02. Let's come to the Z, add in a noise modifier, scale 120, strength 0.02. So now you can see that we have this subtle camera movement back and forth. I think that adds a really nice touch to it. And one last thing we can do, let's go ahead and hit F12 to make a render. And if we bring this down here like that, let's come up to our compositing window. So if we drag this over, compositing, use nodes, we can add in a glare node, put that right there. And there's a few effects from this you can choose from, but I'm just going to choose fog glow for a basic glow effect. And I'll change the size to 9 and set this to low. And there you go. That's a nice simple glow effect that you can do right inside of Blender. Open this back up, and then we can just double check our animation, maybe make any adjustments that you want before you render it out. Something that you could do is enable motion blur in your render settings. You can see right here what that would look like. Personally, I don't like using motion blur for these types of animations, but go ahead and choose whichever one you like. And that should be pretty much it for this video. If you liked it or enjoyed it, go ahead and leave a like and consider subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.